at Chorus Entertainment, and I'm going to be the moderator today. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I'd also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I'm truly honored to be spending the next 45 minutes with you and our esteemed guests to discuss a topic that I think is so important to the workplace, that is fully understanding and including the concept of anti-racism within corporate DEI work. As someone who has worked in this field for over a decade, I have to say that it's only been recently that we've moved away from gender as kind of the primary focus within the DEI space and really taken on a focus around anti-racism, which makes anti-racism as a theory and a practice that much more important to embed into our work. So joining me for this discussion is President of DiversiPro, Hamlin Grange, and DiversiPro Senior Associate Gerard Etienne. So gentlemen, welcome to this call.
Hi, Lenore.
Hi. Just to start, as everyone on this call knows, we're currently in Black History Month, and I know that as a DEI practitioner, we're often challenged by times of significance, where we're asked questions like, shouldn't every month be Black History Month or Pride Month? And I certainly understand those comments, but I personally like to think of these as the times that give us the opportunity to go above and beyond and explicitly make the time to space to drive in and really contemplate the history, the achievements, and what we still have to do. But could you both share your thoughts on what Black History Month means to you?
Yeah, well, let me give a crack at it. That is a really good starting point. And for me, Black History Month is a time for reflection, deep reflection. On a personal level, I think not just the historical nature of the presence of Black people in Canada and in North America in general, but I also think about the more recent arrival of Black people to Canada, and I'm thinking about that wave of domestic workers that came to this country in the 1960s, mostly women, and my mother was one of those women who came to this country and left middle-class jobs and sometimes even businesses, left their families to come to this country, and they built this country. They helped to build this country through the healthcare system. She was a nurse and all those other things. So for me, it's deep reflection and appreciation. I also think about people like Bromley Armstrong. A lot of people don't talk about that, and my good friend, Jean Augustine. That's the reason why we're celebrating this month. I mean, she was the one who brought it forward to Parliament. So for me, Black History Month is a time of reflection, but it's also a time of deep sadness for me too, because I think about the pain and suffering that has taken place on the bodies of Black people as well. So it's a mixed feeling for me, but it's a time for reflection for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, Hamlin, you were bang on in terms of time to reflect. And when I think about it, I'm most associated with Black History Month through Black Americans.
Yeah.
I think we're more likely in my formative years to know about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X than we're likely in Canada to know about Toussaint Louverture, or to even recognize people that have done a major contribution, like Jean Augustine, or Rosemary Sadlier, or Dudley Laws. So to some extent, we haven't yet begun to really talk about what current and past history can teach us about the struggle of a people and overcoming barriers that truly make me proud to be Black and to be a Canadian.
Yeah, well said, yeah.
Thank you both for that, and which kind of turns us well into the kind of the main topic for today, which is anti-racism. And personally, I think that anti-racism is often poorly understood. I think that it's often interpreted as just being not racist, or really being not racist. That sort of intuitive understanding of it is missing the point of the theory and the practice. I'm wondering if I could ask each of you to talk a little bit about, just let's define some principles about what are we talking about when we talk about anti-racism?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm going to get Gerard to weigh in on this because he's done so much work in this area. But let me set the stage a little bit. And when I think about just the concept of anti-racism, I think about what Beverly Danielle Tatum, she talks about that. She says, if you think of racism as a moving sidewalk, like this, the sidewalk, the moving conveyor belt we see at airports, for example. If you think of racism as that, we're all on this moving sidewalk, okay, and it's moving along. And if we're all on the sidewalk, we're all moving along, all of us, all right. But if you think of yourself and you say, well, I'm not racist, but you're standing on the sidewalk, you're being moved along with this system and you're benefiting from this work of the sidewalk. You're in the system. To be anti-racist, what you're actually doing, you're no longer standing on the sidewalk and being moved along by it. You've actually made a decision to turn around and walk in the opposite direction. That's the difference here. That's the difference. And so I always think about that in terms of racism and anti-racism. I just think it's a very powerful imagery that Beverly offers, at least for me, when I think about it in those terms. Gerard, what are your thoughts?
Well, you know what, Hamlin? I think one of the most significant contribution to anti-racism was made 2 years ago by Senator Murray Sinclair.
Yes.
When he talked about systemic racism resulting from policies, practices, procedures that were embedded in a racist logic, and that make even the non-racist act in racist ways. So that's quite profound, because he's not looking anymore as the individual acts. I don't like you because you're Black. I don't like you because you're indigenous. He is looking at what is hard-baked into a policy framework, into our mental construct. And he's saying that that is reproduced in organizations where even the non-racist act in racist ways. So, Lenore, when I hear you talk about this idea of racism, I think it is, and Hamlin said it well, it is no longer about saying I'm not racist, but you're on the sidewalk. It's how are you truly contributing to fundamentally change the system? And if you're not ready to do that because somehow you benefit from it, well, as Murray Sinclair said, you can be a non-racist, but you're acting in racist ways. I think this is quite profound in terms of the thought process now we need to develop in truly understanding what is anti-racism.
I think that's so interesting, that idea, and sort of the other side applies too. And I've heard some people talk in this way that one of the more freeing ideas around anti-racism is to be an anti-racist doesn't mean you're free of all racism. That's not a bar that you're trying to attain. And in a way that can be actually kind of I don't know, almost an inspiring thought, and that it's about being an action and the actions you're taking. It's not about being free of all racism. In fact, that might not be something that's achievable for any person.
You are so right. I was doing a keynote not too long ago where I was saying to people that early on in my life, I was taught to hate indigenous peoples because I grew up in a country where all we saw were cowboy movies. Yeah. And the symbol of the cowboy movie is the Indian who's scalping people and raping white women and pillaging. Yeah. So as a child, if you're bombarded over and over and over again with these messages, it's not because all of a sudden you have some highlight that says to you, you got rid of it. So you need to confront it. And I do that every single day. I try to deconstruct colonial images that I was given. But it is a perpetual work. It's not something that you do once and then that's over. So you point around what needs to be done, and you point around messages that are given to you. You point around that you can never be completely get rid of it. Matters a lot. Because the moment I would think that I am not racist is the moment that I'm racist. I need to be deliberately thinking about it to become fully a non-racist.
And that I've heard, to ask people, asking yourself, am I or am I not racist, isn't really a useful conversation to have with yourself. It's more how has racialization or racism affected me? And now it's a much more productive way of kind of looking at it. So,
you're absolutely right. And I think it's really about interrogating yourselves. I mean, some people say, well, so who should do the work then to stop racism and dismantle racism? Who should be doing it? Well, I'm sorry, it's not for Black people or Indigenous people to do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the fact is, racism is a white construct.
Yes.
If you really think of what a white supremacy is, okay, it is not only about, people are burning crosses on your lawn and things like that. It's about a preference for whiteness. All right. Yes. And so the people who are going to be dismantling racism are the very people who are benefiting from it.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And that's a hard road to go. That's a hard message, I think, for a lot of people to process. All right. And so you need to be able to dismantle that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. And it feeds us nicely with the way you put that into bringing this into the workplace and into this practice of DEI. And, Hamlin, we've talked before that, 10, 15 years ago, it was D. It was diversity. We had chief diversity officers. It was one usually white woman in a company that was doing PowerPoint decks about how many men and women were in the company. And again, I'm not slagging that woman because that was probably very difficult work at that time.
Yeah.
But that was sort of how it started. And then it started to come out from there. And then inclusion came along and it became diversity and inclusion. Sometimes it became inclusion and diversity. Equity has been talked about in governments and academic institutions for a while, but it's really, in my experience, only been the last couple of years that corporations are starting to pull in this idea of equity now into their departments, DEI. I've heard, there's also words accessibility, belonging, there are other words, but I'd still say that DEI, EDI they're the ones that we're sort of seeing more and more. And now, but what we're talking about, what this conversation is today is anti-racism needs to be part of that. It needs to be one of the letters is maybe a too silly way of putting it, but it needs to be part of that. So can you talk a little bit about bringing that anti-racism practice into DEI in a corporate world?
Exactly. I mean, I like to talk about the idea of idea, inclusion, diversity, equity, and anti-racism. So what's the idea of idea? The idea of idea is the fact that you need to center anti-racism in this conversation. I've always believed that, but I think in today's context, think about the racial pandemic that we're going through right now, the racial reckoning pandemic that we're going through right now. We need to center anti-racism in this precisely because of what Gerard was talking about. Gerard is talking about the system itself. And if we look at our system, the system within organizations that benefits some and disadvantage others, we need to talk about race. And so for me, including anti-racism in that conversation, if you truly want to create a diverse, inclusive, and equitable organization, you need to include anti-racism in that conversation. What do you think, Gerard?
Well, he'll never give himself the credit, but the reality is after George Floyd, Hamlin was the first that was talking about having an anti-racist lens. And the reason why that mattered so much is that Canada took a very simplistic view in the early 1980s about race. Canada decided that there were only three races. You could be Indigenous, you could be white in color, Caucasian in race, and everybody else was a visible minority. And this simplistic view is hard baked into every single law, policy, economic, social, you name it. Visible minorities have been with us now for almost 40 years. But what visible minority does is that it takes a bunch of people and put them in a category constructed not for us by us, but constructed by others, which is in essence the summum of racism, because it is making an argument that my lived experience as a Black person is the exact same as someone from China, except the fact that both of us are not white in color, generally speaking. There is nothing else that approximates my lived experience to somebody from Japan or China or even from Africa. So Canada simplistically decided to close its eyes to distortion within the visual minority and have not looked at it for the past 40 years. It was put in a box and we're done. And now the argument is, stop. You are perpetuating your legacy history of anti-Black racism or anti-Indigenous racism, because not all groups in all facets of the workplace experience racism the same way. So the day of reckoning for Canada is to undo those structures that were put in law. They are in a legislative framework that said that there's no difference between an Inuit and a Métis, or between a Métis or First Nations, either status Indian, non-status Indian. That is totally asinine when you think about it. But it was reflective of a point in time. The question for us is, are we at the same point in time in the late 70s, early 80s as we are now? And I don't think so. So therefore, recognizing anti-racism as part of the conversation on inclusion, diversity, equity, to me is absolutely crucial. Otherwise, we are perpetuating the very thing that we are saying that we want to change.
Yeah. And tell me a little bit about what that looks like within sort of the day-to-day, maybe in an organization. So when you say you take a more anti-racist lens to DEI, just can you give me some thoughts about what does that kind of look like for the employee on the ground?
You want me to jump in, Hamlin?
Yeah, go, because I know, please, Gerard, because you've done a lot of these policy reviews, because I think that's where it starts. Go ahead.
That's exactly where I'm going, my friend.
Yeah.
So, Lenore, the biggest mistake organizations tend to think is that they conceive their programs as independent. So they talk about diversity, they talk about equity, they talk about inclusion, they talk about anti-racism sometimes. Yeah. And yet, all of them are joined together. So a starting point for any organization looking at becoming anti-racist in the true sense of the word is to start by what Murray Sinclair was talking about, that people that are in a racist system, even the non-racist, will act in racist ways. So you need to look at every element that composes the system, not just the human capital part, hiring, developing, training, and exiting people. But you must look also at stakeholder engagement. You must look at marketing. You must ask yourself, does the leadership of the organization have the intercultural competence to transit truly to a non-racist organization? The second big element that anti-racism forced us to look at, and that was taken in the 70s from people with a disability, adopted by First Nations, and now we are gladly talking about in the context of anti-racism, is the principle of for us, not without us. So what does an organization that is anti-racist feels like? Is that people at all levels are coming forward to tell their story in a myriad of ways. So we don't have a system yet constructed on the basis of those who conceive and those who execute. So managers will tell you what's good for you. You have a system where employees feel safe enough to come forward and to say, that's how I'm experiencing the workplace.
Can I jump in on that one piece? Sorry, I want to, because this nothing about us without us. How do you walk that line as an organization between meaningful consultation with underrepresented communities, with Black employees even, but to be more specific, and not overdoing it with the emotional burden, emotional tax of kind of asking your racialized employees to solve your problems? And I realize you weren't trying to be that simplistic, but do you have any sort of advice for how to balance that? Because I know that I sometimes even struggle with that.
Yeah, and it is a struggle, and the temptation really is to say, hey, you folks who are being affected by it, you fix it.
Yeah.
Okay, that is a temptation. I think the first and foremost thing is, first of all, I think it's becoming deeply aware. Acknowledge that it exists. It is real, okay, and that it is an enemy. It is an enemy of all of us. Okay, I remember having a conversation with a leader, And she was really struggling. She said that, why is it that we were able to deal with this pandemic and we were able to come up with shared approaches to keep our people safe? Because what was it? Why could we talk about that thing and come around some shared solutions to deal with COVID, but we can't seem to even talk about racism in the workplace? I said, well, what do you think that is? And she had to come to the conclusion, well, because everybody agreed that COVID is a common enemy. COVID can take down all of us, regardless of what our skin color is, regardless of our sexual identity, whatever that is. I said, until we all agree that racism is a virus that can infect all of us and it's a common enemy, that's the problem, okay? And so what I've seen in organizations is that there's some folks who still believe that, oh, racism is not a problem. Yeah. I'm not racist. It's, you know,
and so I'm not racist. Yes,
exactly. Yeah. So I think the way organizations need to start thinking about organizational leaders, educate yourself, come to an understanding that you are part and parcel of the very problem that you're perceiving that needs to get fixed. So educate yourself. That's the first thing, and to also be very keenly aware, with all humility, because the stories we hear from racialized employees, we talk to a lot of racialized employees as part of the work that we do. I got to tell you, Lenore, it is heartbreaking.
Yes.
Heartbreaking to hear the stories. Yes. And we're talking about people who are highly qualified, highly educated. They're working in law enforcement. They're working in law firms. These are and these people break down in tears talking about how racism has impacted their lives, their very career. So that's the first thing. Open your hearts, open your mind, open your ears to listen. That, I think, is the first thing.
And I like that very much, Hamlin, the part about listening. And there's also the point that you made, Lenore, that I totally agree with you in terms of what Hamlin tends to call Black fatigue, the sense that people feel that they need to fix the problem. And I think in the work that we do in that space, we are quite clear as to who has to fix the problem. It's the people who created the problem. But to fix a problem, you have to understand a problem. Yeah. Einstein apparently once said that if the world was coming to an end and he had 1 hour to save the world, he would spend 50 minutes understanding the problem and 10 minutes arriving at a solution. Yeah. In this case of anti-racism, too often organizations are jumping to the solution without truly understanding the problem. So one of the issues that Hamlin has been pushing very hard on is to make sure that voice is given to employees, so people in decision-making capacity can truly have an understanding of the problem that they're trying to fix. Because too often they think they understand the problem, but they do not. Too often they think that they have the cultural competency to fix the problem, and they do not. So that listening part is central to answer the question that you have raised.
Right. That's great. And, you know, it speaks to why it's so much more important to be considering why am I or am I not racist is not going to help with any of these problems. No. How have I been affected by it? How have I benefited? How have others not? That's going to help us get there. So I think that's one of the powerful pieces of this that I've always liked myself. What do you see as some of the barriers to this? So, we've talked about that this is a great approach, but what are you seeing in your organizations you're working with that are barriers to this kind of an approach?
Well, very simple. The hesitancy, the reluctance to share power. Yeah. I believe anti-racism is all about sharing power and recognizing that this is a reality. And I think that becomes a barrier. And so when I talk about power sharing, Lenore, I'm talking about, you hear things like, yes, we want to do the thing, but we don't want to lower standards.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, people aren't entitled to certain things just because of that. I said, well, no. Yep. We've never said lower standards. Yeah. We've never said that. Okay. In fact, we even go as far as saying that if you start thinking about idea in terms of the way you look about how you hire, recruit, you're actually raising standards, not lowering standards. Okay, so I think it's about sharing of power. That becomes a barrier for a lot of things. I think also there's this hesitancy, white fragility, as Robin DiAngelo talks about. That's also a barrier. Okay, that fragility that some white folks have, even just talking and thinking about this. I mean, some folks who are even listening to our conversation may be feeling a little bit scratchy right now.
Yeah.
Just the very fact that we're talking about it.
Yeah.
You need to interrogate yourself about that. Why am I feeling uncomfortable? Yeah. That, I think, is certainly one of the barriers that we need to overcome.
Yeah. And I think there are a couple of things I would like to add to what Hamlin just shared. One of them is that for many people, racism is like the Sasquatch. It might exist, but we've never seen it. So because people are not deeply living this contradiction every day, I'm Canadian, but I'm different. Sometimes they're oblivious to what is my lived experience every time I leave my house and I navigate into a world that keeps reminding me I don't belong. Mm-hmm. But the other thing I also want to add, and this is something that we are finding out, is that as much as Canada, by and large, is still a very much white country, mm-hmm. but in certain places in Canada, you have a more balance in terms of just numbers. And there are people that are coming here with deep hatred for what is Black and deep hatred for what is Indigenous. And I'm using the word not carefully when I say hatred. There are people who are born in countries where their perception of a Black person is as bad as the perceptions of whites could have been at the turn of the 19th century. Yeah. So it makes it even more difficult in this space when we're addressing racism, because in the early 1980s, it was an easy thing to say because you had Caucasians and all others. But now it's much more complex, it's much more nuanced, and it all deals with the fact of racism as a social construct. And the point that Hamlin was making earlier about racism, white supremacy, because to some extent, we have Black people, we have Indigenous people who have internalized the racism that they have endured to come to a point now where, from their perspective, to be white passing, white thinking is the summum of success. So that's how big and deep it is. It's when you yourself cannot recognize who you are and you're trying to emulate a group to say, no, I belong in this society.
Yeah. And we're talking about minimization, aren't we, Gerard?
Yeah.
The whole notion of intercultural competence, that reality of minimization. You will minimize who you are, minimize your differences in order to fit in. It's a survival strategy that the people from the non-dominant culture will do. And we see it played out. We see it every day, the work that we do. And I've seen it over and over again. But you need to ask yourself, as a leader within an organization, is that individual who is minimizing himself or herself in an organization for whatever identity that they are they bringing their whole self to the organization? Are we leaving something on the table? Organizations are missing out when they allow minimization to take place within organizations. And that's also part of the conversation that needs to take place.
So Hamlin has a famous saying, and I think it captures perfectly what he's talking about. Hamlin says all the time, we hire for diversity, but we're on board for conformity. Mm-hmm. So the very thing that we say we want, most organizations did the polar opposite when people come in.
Right.
And those are the kind of things that I think leaders need to ask themselves, exactly what Hamlin is saying. What am I leaving on the table by not acknowledging the person coming with their whole self, that they don't have to park who they are at the door before coming in?
Right. And so we see this kind of, the barriers are reluctance to share power, white fragility, yet what's necessary is a deep understanding, like you said. So it's like, sort of, how do we kind of bridge this? And I think one thing that comes to my mind, because I deal with it a lot in my space, is a lot of the white fragility was wrapped up in this a lot, but you're dealing with a lot of people who are feeling personal guilt and shame. They hear white supremacy and they think you're talking about people, in marches, and they don't think of it in terms of systems. Like how can we start to move the conversation, not in a way that panders, that's not where I'm going with that, but in a way that kind of takes people a little bit out of that personal guilt and shame and into something productive.
Shame is never productive.
Right.
Right. And I mean, once upon a time, diversity training was all about shame and blame. Yeah. Remember that? It was, like the success of our training session was how many white people can you get to cry? It was, shame folks, look, we know that's not productive. And I don't think shame is not a good place to be. I think understanding is a good place to be. Yeah. Okay. Really deeply understanding and to be honest about, and also there's a certain degree of vulnerability, I think, that requires some of that to take place as well. It means that standing in the place of vulnerability and saying that, you know what, I really don't know. I need to find out, and I'm going to go find out. Okay. Yeah. So it's not about being shameful about it. I never try to shame people because I know that is the road to ruin for everything. Okay. Mm-hmm. Shame does not really accomplish anything. And I get it. People always want to do the right thing. What I remind folks is that it's not about doing the right thing. It's about doing the most effective thing. And that's different. It's a very fundamental different way of thinking about all of that. What are your thoughts, Gerard?
No, I think you're absolutely right. So we tend to say you have to be less comfortable with the more comfortable and more comfortable with the less comfortable. So when we start working in an organization, by the time we do the assessment, Hamlin always had a hardworking question for the CEO or for the executive who wants us to come on board. Hamlin tends to ask, are you ready to live in a bit of discomfort? Because to be true to this and to answer your question, Lenore, people needs to see. We never ask people to act. We ask people to see, because the extent to which people can see, then they have the capacity to change whatever they want to change. And what is fascinating for us is that quite often in asking that simple question for people to see, we realize that people tend to overestimate their competency. Mm-hmm. And because people don't see themselves in the lecture of racism or white supremacy or white fragility or exclusion or discrimination. They don't. And because they don't, they think that they are at a place, and always come at a bit of a surprise when we say, well, you're not really there. So a lot of the work we do is to get people to understand. We get people to open their eyes, because the journey that everybody is on is different. People will go at their own space, but the capacity to see something you were not seeing, that's powerful, because once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. Yeah. True. And that for us is an important factor in terms of building organizations that are anti-racist.
And that's a great place here for me to bring up that, in terms of, we're looking at these barriers, we're looking at ways of overcoming them. You've developed a dashboard, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how that role that might play in addressing some of these barriers within organizations taking an anti-racism approach.
Yeah. Well, the old adage, right? What gets measured gets managed. Yeah. What gets measured gets done. I think that's really where it comes from. And so the idea behind the idea dashboard, is to give organizations an opportunity here to answer some pretty hardworking questions within the dashboard itself, and 6 key areas that we talk about, right? And it's really about seeing where you are. It's both a diagnostic tool, but as you go through the process, it's also about an implementation tool as well. So to see, what are we not paying attention to? Gerard already touched on those things. There are particular cylinders that organizations need to focus on: leadership, stakeholder engagement, marketing and communications, products and services, human capital, your HR systems, all of those things. And within the dashboard, you'll be able to answer those questions. You're able to see where you are. Are you red, meaning you're failing it? Are you green, meaning you're passing? Is it amber because you're on your right track, but you have more work to do? So that's really the purpose of the dashboard, and we're really looking forward to to people using the dashboard, because I think it's going to help organizational leaders to really be more focused. It's also going to force them, I think, to start collecting the data and doing the work of the work. Because I think that's really part of it, right? You got to do the work of the work in order to build an idea organization. And that's really what it's about.
And I think I'll add a couple of things to that, Hamlin. One of the benefits of the tool itself, it's this idea that we're not going to give you a fish, we're going to teach you how to fish.
Yeah.
So there is a component of it that the organization can drive. And there is a component of it that the organization can also use as a tool to be quite transparent with employees in terms of where they are doing well and where they're not. Because traditionally speaking, when employees would work around employment equity, what employees would tend to see is the numbers. We are below market availability, or that's the rate of promotion, that's the rate of exit. But none of that get people to understand why. And the tool allows people to understand why, because embedded in the questions will be very much insight as to why you may be below market availability. Right. So therefore, in doing the work, you're actually giving yourself all the capacity you need to go from A to B, because A becomes a benchmark. Then you can measure all the activities you're doing to see how you're progressing through. And that to me is absolutely powerful. And the other element I haven't touched on, but I need to emphasize, is that most often than non, Lenore, organizations are looking at anti-racism. They're looking at inclusion, diversity, equity to the lens of their HR programs, the human capital. We know that this is a limited view. We know, because what gets somebody to come into the organization may not be the human resources that they don't know nothing about. It may be the marketing strategy that a company has, that a department has. So the sense of holistic view of what get one person to be successful, that to me is one of the most appealing factor in the
holistic.
Yeah, it's holistic, absolutely.
And maybe, I actually think we can build on that a little bit around the holistic. I think I will always maintain that HR is a key strategic partner in rolling out a DEI program, but that it extends, you're right, to every strategic element of an organization. There's a question here, though, that came in. I think it's sort of a way you can frame this holistic viewpoint. And thank you, Hamlin and Gerard. In both of your opinions, how does DiversiPro's work help their clients combat racism in their organizations? Specifically, can you help clients unlearn and work towards an anti-racism culture? I understand this is a great journey to walk along.
Well, that's one of those hardworking questions, and
yes.
I think the major thing that we do and we try to do, and I think a lot of us who do this work, yourself included, Lenore, is shine light into dark corners. Yeah. And that's what we do. We try to shine light into dark corners, and those dark corners can be pretty scary for leaders. And some leaders avoid going into those corners because they don't want to do the wrong thing. They don't want to make a mistake, all right? But, I've been very fortunate over the 20 odd years that I've been doing, more than 20 years I've been doing this work, that I've seen leaders who were hesitant to go into those dark corners. And as a result of working with them, oh my goodness, not only do they go into those dark corners, boy, they start turning on light bulbs themselves. For me, that is a measure of success. When organizations begin to shine the light within their own corners, on their own. So I've been very fortunate. I'm happy to see that happen. And I think that's the goal, I think, for the work that we do in this space, all of us, whether it's Gerard, myself, or you, or others who may be listening to this discussion, that is our goal. That is our wish. That we'll help organizations to shine the light in the corners. Yeah, Gerard.
And to shine the light, we typically do 4 things.
Yeah.
The first, we ask a very simple question. Does your executive or management team have the intercultural competence to shine the light?
Yeah.
When you hire a manager, an executive, a leader, most often you're going to test as to whether or not they have a budget experience, whether they have human resources management experience, program development. We test on a bunch of stuff, but rarely do we ask, do you have the competency to actually have intercultural mindset? So that's the first thing that we ask, because failure of understanding that point, everything else doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And please remember that Peter Drucker once wrote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast."
Yeah, yeah.
So in essence, Lenore, if your executive team don't have the intercultural competence to lead a strategy or an idea, we're not further advanced. So that's the first thing we ask.
Yeah.
The second thing that we ask is exactly what Murray Sinclair said. You need to take an anti-racism lens to your policy framework. Over the past 40 years, we were taking an equity lens. An equity lens is not the same as an anti-racist lens.
Yeah.
And heart-baked, hardwired into most of our policies is exactly racist policies. I totally believe in what Senator Sinclair said. The third thing that we try to do to shine that light that Hamlin is talking about is a deep dive with employees.
Yeah.
We do surveys with employees. We do focus groups with employees. We do one-on-one interviews with employees. By the time that we're done, we can present to decision makers a compelling view in terms of how the employees are feeling. It always comes as a shock. It always comes as a shock, because most of the time when an organization asks their employees, it's like the server asking me, is the food good? Typically the response is yes, thank you.
Yeah.
But there wasn't any necessity to deep into whether or not I really like the food. So what we are doing now is going beyond the lipstick on a pig. It's going beyond the survey and truly ask employees how they experience the workplace. And last but not least, we leave behind ideas on structure. We leave behind ideas on measurement. We leave behind ideas on looking at progress over time. So when we are done, if the organization decides, which by the way has not yet been our experience, but if the organization decides not to look, then we know that that's by choice, not by ignorance. And that's a lot of work that we do.
Yeah. I appreciate the comments, and wanted to jump in and say that we are open to questions from viewers. Right now, we have a couple of, they're not questions, but they're comments, but I thought I'd read them for you because I think they're kind of interesting. Yeah. One viewer said, for white leaders who are reluctant to share power, I sometimes see minimization as a strategy to avoid discomfort and maintain the status quo. And I think that avoiding discomfort is a human trait. And, so learning, that's a thing we have to learn, is discomfort. And then another comment, to do this work, it is secondary trauma to listen to these stories over and over again. Yes. And I think the safety of, it sort of goes back to our emotional tax and meaningful consultation, but without overly burdening employees. I think we hit on that a bit earlier.
Lenore, pardon me, I jump in because that very observation is such a powerful observation. And I'll tell you, when we talk to employees and they share with us their experiences, it re-traumatizing them because they're reliving that experience. Yeah. What I've been noticing, though, even among our colleagues that work with us, is traumatizing our people as well as they listen to those stories. And some of our folks have had to take some mental health days to step away from this work. This emotional tax works multiple ways, right? And so, I'm very mindful of that. I know I've been personally affected when I hear those stories from folks. And so it is, as I said, it is heartbreaking and it is traumatic. It can be traumatizing for some people. Yeah.
Now, one thing and as we start to wrap up here, one piece that I thought I'd ask about is that we've delved into some very deep and emotional topics here today, but something that never ceases to amaze me as a DEI leader is that when you develop an inclusive hiring practice, it's actually just a best practice hiring practice. An inclusive performance management process is actually a best practice. It's about having consistent measurements, about removing bias. So which really does I do tend to have an approach as well that, this actually can drive business success.
Yep.
It can be a sensitive topic because for some that feels like it's sort of a more of a hard way of looking at something that's a very personal issue. I don't necessarily think it has to be either or, but what are your thoughts around the fact that this is actually at the end of the day also about business success?
Yeah.
Wow.
Sorry, I'll jump first and I'll let you go.
Yeah, no, go.
Lenore, you bang on. And there has been a lot of conversations over the years about reasons why organizations should undertake an inclusion, diversity, equity, and anti-racism perspective.
Yep.
And this idea of strategic choice, it's about market and so on. But right now we are living a reality that to me is fundamentally different than anything I could think of before. And the reality is twofold. The first is that employees, Hamlin tends to say, as opposed to moving up the intercultural competence to maybe acceptance or adaptation, they have gone to polarization. So employees are making a choice now to use social media to out their employers.
Yeah.
And when they do, there is a reputational cost that goes along with that. But more fundamentally, why would you want diversity if it is not to look at how it can contribute meaningfully to your organization? So any organization, any executive, any leader who think otherwise, they're actually hurting themselves personally and they're hurting their business. And there's no going backward.
Yep.
We're always gonna want to know that we have the best people working for us. And as Hamlin said so well, let's drop the argument of lowering the standard. That's just garbage. Let's understand that there may be different standards for different groups, which is the essence of equity.
Yeah.
But not maximizing that capacity, you will be losing ground. There's no doubt in my mind.
Yeah, and that whole notion here of the when I was thinking back, in the early days, the debate was, show us the business case for diversity. Remember that?
Yeah.
Remember that? Remember that old saw? What's the business case for diversity?
Yeah.
What's the business case? We don't have to make the business case for diversity anymore. It's there. It's writ large, and companies that don't see the business case for diversity, they won't exist for not too long. All right.
Yeah.
So let's get it out of the way. There's no longer the business case here anymore. Okay.
Yeah.
It's really about, how do we leverage diversity?
Yeah.
And that's what true inclusion is all about, right? How do we make the diversity that we have within our organizations work for the benefit of the organization?
Yeah.
Okay. And do it in a way that values people's contributions, give people a true sense of belonging to the organization. All right.
Yeah.
And so everyone feel that they're invested in this process. Okay. That's the challenge. And so I don't want to have a conversation anymore. People talk about what's the business case? Why should we do it? If you haven't figured it out yet, something, go back in your cave and enjoy your sleep. I mean, I think a lot of people have moved beyond that. Okay. Yeah. And people are now saying we need to move forward. And to Jara's point about that minimization, moving to, and especially people from the non-dominant perspective, those minorities in your workplaces, Indigenous, Black, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, they're looking at you, they're polarizing. It's us versus them now.
Yeah. Great.
Your job as a leader, you are now managing that firewall between the minimization mindset that says, hey, let's all get along together, all lives matter, between folks on the other side who are saying, until Black lives matter, until Indigenous lives matter, until Asian lives matter, all lives cannot matter. Right. That's the promise. That's the challenge within organizations right now that leaders must confront. And if they're not prepared to deal with that, then they're not creating an anti-racist organization. All they're doing is, to Gerard's point, they're putting lipstick on a pig, and nobody wants to do that. All right.
Excellent. I mean, that actually feels like a little bit of a mic drop moment right there. But we are starting to come to a little bit over our time, so we need to start to wrap up. Any final comments from each of you as we wrap up here?
No, Gerard, you go first because you're always more profound than me.
As if. Thank you, Hamlin. Look, folks, understand this as a journey. I don't think anybody is expecting that a country that has our foundation, that overnight somehow everything will be fine. But I think the point that Lenore made at the beginning of the interview, it's all I want to leave you with. You cannot call yourself not racist. You need to get to be anti-racist. And what that means in real terms, you need to start questioning everything you do, and you need to start deconstructing the system to allow more people under the tent. If you're not ready to do that, we're not ready to advance as a country. And a country that doesn't recognize anti-racism as a problem they need to fix, eventually social cohesion breaks down, and eventually you no longer have a country. So it is time for us now to really think deeply about how to become anti-racist. Hamlin, over to you, my friend.
Well, the only thing I could add to that, Gerard, I go back to that analogy of the moving sidewalk. You know, we see them at airports all the time. Recognize and realize that the sidewalk is always moving. Think of the sidewalk as racism. We're on it. Regardless of your identity, you're on the sidewalk, we're all moving. And you can decide what you're going to do. Are you going to just stay on the sidewalk and just blithely go along and take advantage, even though you may not realize you're taking advantage of it? Or are you going to turn around, look the other way, and walk against the grain to change the system? That's a choice. That's a choice. And as leaders and as individuals, not just leaders, individuals within an organization, I think it's a worthwhile choice to make. I really think so.
Excellent. Thank you both. And certainly that analogy stuck with me because I've always felt that am I or am I not racist? Not helpful. How am I racist? Not only helpful, but it's productive. It can be energizing. It's something to solve. It's something to understand. And so listen, thank you, Hamlin and Gerard, for sharing your thoughts. I can't believe how quickly the time went. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who participated, to the folks at DiversaPro who helped form this. Nicole, it's been a pleasure as always. And to the rest of you listening, if you want, you can visit diversapro.com. There's going to be a recording of this presentation if you'd like to take a look at it or share it. So other than that, just everyone stay healthy and safe until